Okay, so tonight we're going to look at the chosen who was not of the chosen. Uh, so in this session, I'm honestly trying to be more efficient than in the last couple of sessions, and I'm trying to stick to main themes and not get as carried away about the literary styles and the words as I sometimes do. But I do think that it helps to have an overview. And I feel like the simpler structures of the overview have been better received. So the outline that I'm going to share of Isaiah 45 is actually the simplest. It's from J. Leo Green's book uh, that I've quoted before, and that Waylene is using in her Sunday school, and that is uh, God Reigns. So Green sees Isaiah 45, 1 through 8, as being a whole passage on the commissioning of Cyrus, which it essentially is, and it ends with kind of a hymnic fragment in verse 8. And then after that hymnic fragment that indicates God's purpose and the wonderful thing God is going to do, naturally, wherever you have a spiritual step forward, you have a consummate step back against us as our enemy reacts to it and counterattacks. So in 45, 9 through 13, God has to respond to Israel's whining, to their complaining about the way that he is doing it. Now, Isaiah 45, 14 through 7 exposes the dangerous contradiction between those who are confused by idolatry and the idea that, well, these idol worshippers have conquered us, therefore maybe there's something to their gods after all. And it's a lot like people in our culture who go, whoa, these sinners are rich, they have mansions, they seem to be happy. Maybe they've got something. Maybe our idea of sacrifice and giving and loving as being self-giving is a little off base. But Isaiah, with God's prompting, is saying that the idolatry worship is confusion, and your choice is either everlasting salvation or worthless worship of idols, which in chapter 46 he's going to make clear when he makes fun of the people taking all their gold and putting it in and melting it with a goldsmith and making an idol out of it. And then that idol, has to have a pedestal to sit on, to stand on, and in order not to be knocked over and such like. It's just, it's pretty funny as a parody. And I want to spend more time with it. And Isaiah 45, 18 through 25, uh, Green calls the climax of Cyrus's impact. Now, it's not that Cyrus is going to do all the things that we see there, even though I picture him standing on the steps of a palace. But it's that what he does has enough impact that it allows God's purpose of everlasting salvation to take place. And this session, instead of translating everything myself, I'm going to rely on the translations of Claus Westermann and John D.W. Watts, because I like what they've done, even though Westermann's is a little more archaic than mine would be. So, thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I hold, to subdue nations before him, and I ungird the loins of kings, to open doors before him, and gates remain unbarred. So in these verses, we have the second to last specific, the second and last specific reference to Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. And, um, and the supreme importance of this oracle needs to be seen right away because it ties the prophet's message of comfort to the event that's about to happen to these people. And it does it in a way that's absolutely going to shock Israel. In fact, even in this first verse, what we have is a tremendous shock. And it makes a radical break to everything she had previously believed because it says God makes Cyrus, a heathen king, to be his anointed agent through whom God intends to set Israel free. So the amazing thing here is that Cyrus is a non-Israelite, and he's not even a proselyte, as I will prove to you later in the presentation, but he's said to be God's anointed. And this is the only place in the whole Old Testament that an outsider is given this designation. And so we need to pay attention to the fact that something special, something relatively unique is happening here. Now, some have pointed out, and rightly so, that the Hebrew word for anointed is the same word from which we get the word Messiah. But we need to be careful because in the Old Testament, the word still hadn't yet been used with that future meaning of a triumphant king and deliverer in the physical world that it came to get somewhere between Daniel and the intertestamental period and the time of Jesus. They're suddenly expecting this physical king, this political king, this powerful king to show up and deliver them. But in the Old Testament, it was generally used for sanctifying or consecrating Israel's rulers and commissioning the high priest. And so Cyrus is now called by the title because the Lord has installed him as the ruler over nations and entrusted him with the strength to fulfill all of God's purposes. Now, of course, there is a question, thus says Yahweh to his anointed to Cyrus. There is a question as to how Cyrus was supposed to have received this message from the Lord. Was the prophet speaking to a local audience that this is what Yahweh had spoken directly to Cyrus? Or was he telling his audience that this is a message from Yahweh that we've sent via a herald to this future conqueror? In fact, was the prophet playing politics by encouraging an imminent invasion, by assuring the foreign ruler that God was on his side? Or was the prophet looking back now on a successful invasion and informing the new leader who had just shown up that God had given him the victory? Well, I definitely think that the prophet was speaking to Israel at the time when the prophet said these words. But I also think he was sharing what God had at least implicitly, if not explicitly, revealed to Cyrus. Now, I think this is so because of what we're going to see in verses 9 through 13. And as I was preparing tonight's session, I was delighted to discover that this is what my old Hebrew professor wrote in his commentary. Quote, "It is probable that the oracle was intended for an Israelite audience, even though it was ostensibly directed to Cyrus." And then Westermann agrees with that as well. So before we move to verse 2, I want to point out God's promise to ungird the loins of kings, which is going to be balanced later in verse 5 with God's promise in verse 5 to gird Cyrus. And I just want to remind you that girding in the ancient world meant belting yourselves in and preparing for battle so that your armor, what you had of it, wasn't flopping around getting in your way of wielding your sword or your shield. And I want you to remember that even in Ephesians 6:14, when Ephesians draws from the armor of the Roman soldier and spiritualizes it, it says, have your loins gird with truth. So clearly, when God says, I'm going to ungird the loins of kings, it means they're going to be unprepared for battle. And then also, when he says, I'm going to gird up Cyrus, it says, I'm going to prepare you for battle. So that is a promise of victory. But there are those who have problems with literalism. And the Bible is so rich and so multi level that we have to be careful with literalism. Because a lot of people say that this is contradictory. Because in this verse, we have open doors before him. And later in the oracle, we're going to have bronze doors busted open. And here, gates remain unbarred. And in a later verse in this oracle, we're going to have the iron bars cut or shattered or destroyed. So people are saying that, this is inconsistent, that this is contradictory, this is the Bible contradicting itself. But the reality is what this is poetry. And poetry speaks in images. And the image of an open door is an opportunity. And the image of the gates unbarred is an image of an easy victory. And if you'll remember the passage from Herodotus that I read, last week when we talked about Cyrus diverting the Euphrates, remember that in Herodotus' account, they were having a festival in the middle of the city, and Cyrus's troops arrive. They don't have weapons ready. They're not ready. They're not expecting anything. And so they surrender without a fight. If that isn't open doors, if that isn't unbarred gates, I don't know what is. But the imagery we'll see later on is the imagery of God removing obstacles. And the fact is, God did remove obstacles. Now, the prophecy is true, but once again, humankind wants to have everything their way. They want to understand everything the way they want to understand it. And, that just isn't the way the Bible necessarily works. The Holy Spirit constantly shows us new depth and new meaning and new power. Well, let me move on and hopefully try to demonstrate that. So here's where the contradiction allegedly occurs, where God is saying, I myself go before you and level the ways, the mountains, the swelled ridges. It's an unusual word used in an unusual way. And then I break in pieces doors of bronze and cut asunder bars of iron. Now, this should remind us, at least in the first phrase, of the way that was being prepared in Isaiah 40. The forerunner of this chosen one was to raise the crevices or the valleys to a level road, or reduce the mountains or the humps uh, to a level road so that the chariot would not go out of round. Now, in this case, it's not a typical word for mountains. Like I said, it's probably the closest to the word for swelling. And so the Dead Sea Scroll, 1 Qumran Isaiah, read mountains. The Syriac translation recognized that swelling is not necessarily really high. So the Syriac translation translated it as uneven land. And August Piper uh, called them swelling ridges. And he said, leveling them is, quote, a figurative expression for removing all obstacles from the way. And so his explanation also solves the alternate reading from the Latin translation of the text. The Vulgate reads, ego ante te ibo e gloriosos terrae humiliabo, which in my translation is, I will go before you and humble the powerful of the world, or the glorious of the world. So presumably the glorious or the powerful would have a swelling of armies keeping them in power. So Yahweh would be leveling them much as he would a mountain or uneven terrain. So it's a powerful promise that rivals the promises that Yahweh had made to Israel when they were conquering the land of promise in the first place. But why doors of bronze? I think it's because bronze is definitely stronger than wood, even though sometimes they just put bronze plating on the wood to keep the wood from splintering as easy. But if Yahweh is breaking down the doors of bronze, that's very powerful. Herodotus suggests that there were 100 gates of bronze in Babylon that the Babylonians thought would be impregnable. Now, if you combine that imagery with the imagery of cutting apart or shattering iron bars, then cutting iron bars would have required heating them up in those days. In fact, even when I was in college, and working in a machine shop on summers and weekends, we used a stationary circular saw uh, with a grinder wheel, and it would heat up the bars by using friction as the composite material in that grinder wheel would wear down, so that you were able to cut through the iron bars. But if you got in a hurry, what would happen is that the composite wheel would bind up uh, in the slot that you were cutting on the iron bars, and it would cause enough vibration that it would cause the composite wheel to break up and shatter and fly everywhere. So obviously we wore safety glasses when we were working with that. And I went through a lot of composite blades that summer through friction. And of course, those of you who know my general clumsiness can be sure I shattered a few expensive blades too. But what we see here is that no matter how hard it is, whether you would be busting through doors of iron or whether you were cutting asunder bars of iron, what happened is God promised to remove the hardened obstacles between Cyrus and his reward. Now, some translations, like the Vulgate that used the verb confrigam, read this as destroying or shattering the iron bars. And that's a possible reading, but it's simply a more intense way of saying that God is removing an obstacle. So there's really no difference except in the way we picture the removal of the obstacle. And the obstacles, they're removed for the purpose of rewarding Cyrus for obedience. And what is that reward, and why is God granting it to him? Well, verses 3 and 4 answer that question. I give you treasures of darkness, secret hoards, that you may know that I am Yahweh, who call you by name, the God of Israel. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by name. Give you a name of honor who do not know me. Now, treasures in the darkness clearly means wealth in hidden vaults or even buried treasure. And it seems apropos that these would be surrendered to Cyrus since they represented plunder by other kings. These were royal treasuries and temple treasuries. You know, those of you who attended the Sermon on the Mount study on Friday night should remember how in the ancient world, temples served as banking centers with their treasure rooms, which had been carried away as plunder, much like all the treasures of the temple in Jerusalem had been carried away as spoil by Nebuchadnezzar. So the treasures that Cyrus seized in Babylon made the Persians rich. But ironically, that wealth would end up making Persia vulnerable to a Macedonian by the name of Alexander the Great later, just as it did Babylon. And in a similar vein, secret hoards would refer to gems that were hidden away, probably in secret chambers. So Cyrus collected all of these treasures, but there was another reward that Cyrus didn't collect. So you remember, notice here, for the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by name. This is the second time that he said to Cyrus, I'm going to call you by name, as though you are mine, as though you belong to me, as though you are my child. I give you a name of honor, even though you don't know me. Now, remember last week in chapter 44:5, not chapter 45:5, chapter 44:5, where we looked at this jug handle and the seal on the jug handle that said, belonging to Malak, the king, and then down below, Hezekiah's name. And we said that this idea of writing on one's hand belonging to Yahweh is a way of becoming a member of the family, becoming identified with the family if you were a servant, and then being given a name of honor meant that you were given a surname to say you were part of that family. So what God was saying was, I offered to make you one of the family. I called you and treated you like one of the family. I was giving you a name of honor like one of the family. Now, God says, I'm doing it for the sake of Jacob, Israel, my people, but you can accept that honor. You can accept that salvation as well. So he gives Cyrus a title and a temporary blessing that Cyrus could have had permanently if he had trusted Yahweh. But we have evidence that he didn't choose that. The Cyrus cylinder. And in the Cyrus cylinder, he had written this testimony. Marduk, the great Lord, a protector of his people, worshipers, beheld with pleasure Cyrus' good deeds and his upright mind, and therefore ordered him to march against his city Babylon. He made him set out on the road to Babylon, going at his side like a real friend. But here's the irony. Marduk is not a Persian god. He's a Babylonian god. And rather than responding to Yahweh on this cylinder, Cyrus gives credit for his victory to Marduk. And here's one of the lessons that I was reminded of that's also illustrated again in the middle section of the chapter. God can use anyone or anything to accomplish his will, but that doesn't mean they will open themselves up to be transformed. I remember Balaam's ass in the book of Numbers. Now, just because God could put his words in the mouth of a dumb animal doesn't mean the dumb animal has become human. The ass didn't leave that trip and talk to people for the rest of his life. He only talked because God put his words in the animal's mouth for the purpose of warning and instructing Balaam. And as for Cyrus's giving credit to Marduk, I reflected just how often I've seen God do wonderful things for people. And in return, they give credit to coincidence, superstition, luck, their own skill or intelligence, or some human agency. And in fact, verse 4 specifically says that Cyrus didn't know God, as though God was giving him a chance to be transformed. And so that's why this message to Cyrus continues with the following. I, Yahweh, and no other. Beside me, there is no God. I gird you, and you know me not. Now, what we're going to see throughout chapter 45 is a repetition of the phrase, I am Yahweh and there is no other, or I am Yahweh and no other. And here we see a repetition of, you know me not. So that you know me not underscores the idea that Cyrus doesn't recognize and he won't acknowledge God to be his benefactor. How very like many, many people today. In fact, the images on the right in photographic form as well as sketch form were inscribed with an inscription that makes it seem like Cyrus was regarded as something of a divine figure, at least a four-winged angel of some kind. Now, the inscription, which actually was added later than Cyrus's time, reads, I am Cyrus the king and Achaemenian. Now, it would certainly suggest that Cyrus never had a clue as to why he was so blessed. But our text goes on, and after reaffirming that God is the only God, reiterates God's purpose in commissioning Cyrus. That men may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I, Yahweh, and there is no other. It is I who form light and create darkness, make weal and create woe. I, Yahweh, who do all these things. Now, this is not just so that Israel can be liberated, but it's so the whole world from east to west can know that God is the only God. But this isn't a weak monotheism either. It doesn't avoid contradictions or dissonance. There's no dualism, as in the Persian theology, where evil is as powerful as good. But verse 7 is most eloquent, and the wording is very interesting. Even though I said I wasn't going to translate, I translated this. God, who created light out of nothing, he barad light in Genesis 1. And so now it says he forms or sculpts the light, and he baraz, he creates darkness out of nothing. And God, whom we know as the God of peace and well-being, shalom in the Old Testament, now he accomplishes peace and well-being, but he baraz, creates as only God can create, creates trouble or evil out of nothing. In fact, the Isaiah scroll, 1 Qumran Isaiah, reads that he accomplishes good and creates trouble out of nothing. So I have to agree with the early 20th century commentator George Smith, who said, God's sovereignty could not be more broadly stated. All things, irrespective of their character, are from him and for his ends. Now, we don't understand everything about how this works, but as I'll share in Sunday's message, there was a very famous battle in the naval battle in the 16th century where the victorious admiral said that the very storm that had forced his fleet back from what they thought was their objective delayed and disrupted the enemy fleet. And even though all of his commanders were extremely disappointed that they hadn't been able to attack the enemy where they wanted to attack him, they ended up being closer to their home. And when the enemy showed up, they had the advantage. They had what in naval days of sail was called the wind gauge. And with the wind advantage, you almost always came out ahead. So the victorious fleet that was so disappointed at not getting their original goal ended up with an advantage that, as you'll find out on Sunday, changed history. And the point is that when we may only see evil, God may be accomplishing good. So why all of this emphasis on Cyrus? Why did God do this? Well, when the prophet declared Cyrus to be God's anointed, it broke the link with the expectation that God would bring a political king to restore Israel. Because what God had previously done with Israel's political king, he showed he can do with an alien king, the king of an alien power and a believer in an alien religion. So, in principle, declaring Cyrus as his chosen strips Israel of any potential political power. So the moment the Cyrus oracle was spoken, Israel as God's people, ceased to be a people with political power. This break didn't have to wait for the coming of Christ. It took place right then. Now, of course, it took the coming of Christ to announce and to initiate God's new kingdom, which did not depend upon political power. So then we move to a brief hymnic fragment as a transition that leads us from God's intent with Cyrus toward God's reprimand to the Israelite whiners. Shower, ye heavens, from above. Ye clouds, rain down salvation. Let the earth open, in salvation bear fruit. I, Yahweh, have created it. Now, hymns regularly affirm what the prophet has just stated. You know, we sing our theology not so much to learn it as to affirm it and remind ourselves, and to, basically, make sure that those neuron channels are functioning in our brains. So appropriately, what we see is a call for the skies to rain and the fertile earth to open her womb to provide results. And so the issue of this marriage of heaven and earth is to be prosperity and salvation. Now, I love this because it turns expectations upside down. Because in the ancient world, it was the false gods like Baal and Marduk who promised the rains upon the earth like a conjugal marriage act so that there could be prosperity. But now the affirmation is that Yahweh made all of this possible. So even celebrating Cyrus's imminent success, the hymnic fragment underscores everything with the sovereignty of God. So F.B. Meyer, the great pulpiteer, sees this hymnic fragment as the answer to Israel's prayer. And he spiritualizes it like this. To the eye of the seer, the prophet, the earth lies open to heaven as a wide cornland over which the clouds of heaven hang. The air breathes, and the sun sheds sheets of light. Those clouds are big with righteousness, the special term used throughout this book of the faithfulness of Jehovah. So that was F.B. Meyer's take on this particular fragment. And spiritualizing it, yes, the shower they were looking for was righteousness. And the produce they did want was salvation and peace and obedience and partnership, covenant with God, covenant righteousness. But God has made it possible, even though he used Cyrus. But like I said, wherever you have a spiritual step forward, you're going to have a counterattack from the evil one and his minions. So the prophet recognized that as he's delivering this even, there is a grumbling in the crowd. There is a dissatisfaction. There is a hostile reaction. But fortunately, God gives him, through the Holy Spirit, the message to respond. And it's a familiar message with a familiar metaphor to respond. Woe to him who goes to law with his maker, a potsherd among earthen potsherds. Does the clay say to him who fashions it, what are you making? Does your work say, it has no hands? Or I'm not the work of your hands? Totally questioning the way God is working. Now, that first part, woe to him who goes to law with his maker, is basically saying, if you bring a lawsuit against God, you're going to lose. Why? Because you're just an ordinary pot among ordinary pots. Whereas Yahweh is God, there is no other. So, do we say to God, who do you think you are using a non-Israelite like Cyrus for your salvation plan, for your purpose? Who do you think you are? And yet, we have people who say, who do you think you are calling this guy as a church leader? Who do you think you are letting this denomination have success? Who do you think you are allowing this kind of evil to exist in the universe? Who do you think you are making it so that you have to receive Jesus in order to be saved? Who do you think you are telling me that what I want to do is sin? Because that's the way humans are. They were saying, who do you think you are calling Cyrus the anointed, Cyrus the chosen, Cyrus the instrument of deliverance? And yet it's not our call. So, just as stupid as it would be, for the pot to say, what do you think you're doing? What do you think you're making? In the same way, it would be ridiculous, and it is ridiculous when we question what God is doing. Even if God is letting a church that doesn't operate like we think it ought to operate to be successful. Even if God is allowing people to have influence online or elsewhere that we don't think they should. But it goes on. Woe to him who says to a father, what are you begetting? Or to a woman, with what are you in travail? Now, the imagery here is essentially, you know, asking your father and mother, what were you thinking when you conceived me? You know, what are you thinking as you raised me? And yet, the parents should, at least theoretically and usually, know more and know better than the child. And God, as the parent, knows how he's shaping Israel as a nation, knows how he's shaping Israel as the people from whom his promise will be fulfilled, and knows how he's shaping each and every one of us as individuals. So he makes the application in verse 11. Thus says Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, and his Maker. Will you question me about my children, or command me concerning the work of my hand? Where is that? It may be archaic, but I had another F.B. Meyer quote for you here somewhere. Here we go. So, side by side, says Meyer, with this avowal of the divine determination, this strange command breaks in. God, in his everlasting redemptive purpose, as Yahweh, he who causes to be, he who is, he who will be, and the Holy One of Israel, the perfection of God, and his maker, suggesting the fact that as creator, as the potter, he has the authority over his people. So, as the Holy One, this contrasts with the abominations of the idols that are worshipped in Mesopotamia. And the maker suggests that God is the one who is responsible for what Israel as a nation, as the people of the promise, and what we as individuals and we as a church, as the people of the promise, are going to become. Now, because there are all these false gods, God comes back to the basics, and that's creation. But once again, he kind of reverses things. He says, I made the earth and I barad man upon it. It was my hands that stretched out the heavens, and I command all their host. So once again, we have that idea that God kind of turns things around, because we're used to Genesis 1, where God barad the heavens and the earth, where God barad the light, where God barad the firmament, where God barad uh, the, uh, the waters and the animals and mankind. But in this case, God baras man and makes the earth. But God is not just a God who stands apart here and baras, but God is the one who stretched out the heavens. And we remember from the Psalms that it's the work of his fingertips. It's not even his whole hands involved. All it takes is God's fingertips to stretch out the heavens. And I command all their host. Now, a host, as I reminded folks in Waylene's lesson on Sunday morning, is an army. It's a multitude of powerful people at God's disposal. When we talk about the Lord God of hosts, we're saying Yahweh, God of armies. Hosts also in the ancient world was the idea that the stars represented power, and sometimes angels, although the New Testament discourages that because people began to worship angels as opposed to just recognizing them as representations of God's servants. But when it says, I command all their host, to anybody who thinks that the stars, who thinks that the angels have particular power, God is reminding them, I put those in place and I command them and I know what's going to happen. And even though the writer of second Isaiah wouldn't have any clue whatsoever what a dwarf star was as opposed to a supernova, what he knew was there were different brightnesses up there in the skies, and God commanded and took care of all of them. Now, why do I have Cyrus pictured outside the walls? Because God is coming back to Cyrus now in verse 13. I have aroused him in grace and I make straight all his ways. He shall build my city and shall set free the captives of my people, not for price and not for reward, says Yahweh, oh yeah, of hosts. First he says, I command them all, and now he says, they're at my disposal. I am Yahweh of armies. I am Yahweh who is in charge. Now, this word for aroused has that idea of raising up, that idea of getting the attention, of getting them ready to act. And God says, I've done this in grace, not because Cyrus deserved it, but because I'm at work here. And I didn't do it with an expectation of returns. Actually, I did it because I'm going to make sure that all his ways are straight. Now, guess what? The Hebrew word for straight is the root word for righteousness. And so, what it's saying here is that I will make sure that he accomplishes what's right. I will make sure that he does what is needed to be done. And as a result, what's going to happen? He shall build my city. Okay. Did Cyrus's takeover of Babylon make possible what eventually became the rebuilding of Jerusalem? Did Cyrus make possible the release of some captives to go back to Jerusalem? And so did Cyrus put portions of God's plan of rescuing Israel back into place? Yes, he did. But who is God talking to here? He's talking to Israel, and he's talking to the disgruntled, frustrated, defeated, whining, complaining people of Israel who were absolutely certain that this was a problem and that the prophet must be a false prophet talking about God choosing a non-Israelite as his chosen. Well, then we have a strange. In verse 14, it says, the wealth of Egypt and the produce of Ethiopia and the Sabaeans, men of stature, come over to you and are yours. They follow you. They go in chains. They bow down to you. They pay homage to you, saying, God is with you. And there is no other, no God. Now, wow, this is really strange. And Westermann comments on how strange it is. Because reprimanding Israel that they shouldn't be arguing with him, all of a sudden here is this future promise of what's going to happen. And what people are going to say is that God's with you and there's no other, no God that you can believe in. But then it almost seems to contradict again. Truly thou art a God who hidest thyself, O God of Israel, a Savior. Well, when is God hiding himself? Well, according to these disgruntled, frustrated, defeated Israelites, God's hiding himself right then. They can't see God at work. But this oracle is saying God may hide himself here temporarily, but he is the God of Israel. He is a savior. So what's going to happen? All of these people around you, all of this false culture, verse 16, is going to be brought to shame and brought to nothing. The makers of idols go in confusion together. But, oh man, conjunctions are important. But the exact opposite. Israel finds help in Yahweh, help forever. You shall not be brought to nothing. How different from the idol worshippers. You shall not be put to shame. How different from the idol worshippers. Even though you notice the order is reversed. So being brought to nothing is probably worse than being brought to shame. So we have a process in verse 16, being put to shame and brought to nothing. And now we have the assurance coming in reverse order. You're not going to have the full devastation of being brought to nothing. And you're not even going to be put to shame to all eternity. So this whole paragraph at the close of the chapter absolutely has salvation as its keynote. Does God hide himself? He's the God of Israel, the Savior. Are the makers of idols shamed and confounded? Yet Israel is saved with an everlasting salvation. Are graven images held up in contempt? It's because they're gods that can't save. Does God assert his unveiled, unrivaled deity? It's because he's a just God and a Savior. Are men bidden to look at him, though they be far removed from the ends of the earth? Yes, that they may be saved. And so, primarily, as Meyer says, this salvation is about the emancipation of Israel and their restoration to Jerusalem, but it's also about deliverance, even the deliverance from the guilt and the power of sin as the fixed purpose of God. Because as sure as the creation of earth and man that we just read about, as sure as guaranteed by the hand that stretched out the heavens, as sure as the word that commands all powers, the host, the armies, as sure as God is God, God promises to bring his people again to the land of Israel. For thus says Yahweh, who created the heavens, he, God, who formed the earth and made it, he established it. He did not create a chaos, he formed it to be inhabited. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. How often have we heard that over and over again throughout the chapter? I did not speak in secret in a land of darkness. I did not say to the offspring of Jacob, seek me in chaos. I am Yahweh, who speaks salvation, who declares what is true. Now, I kind of cheated, and I give you an image of God speaking to Job out of the whirlwind. And actually, when God spoke to Job out of the whirlwind, his family probably wasn't there like he is in the picture, but William Blake is probably the most famous artist on Job, so I just chose this picture because when I think of God as speaking as I am Yahweh and there's no other, and that God who establishes order and explains his order, I think about that conversation God has where he asks him all the questions about the wild goats and all of that. But here, what we have is a picture of Mesopotamian religion, maybe even Babylonian religion as we understand it. Because in all the other religions of the ancient world, their God, their primary God or their God who comes out on top, is the God who creates out of chaos. In Mesopotamia, The god El, a generic name for God, the god El comes up against Lord Chaos and Judge River. Guess what? Water always represents chaos. And how does El win? He fights a battle with chaos and Judge River, who is also chaos, in order to establish order, establish uh, a solid creation, a dependable creation. But God is saying he didn't create a chaos and he didn't have to defeat a chaos. Instead, he formed a world of order in order for it to be inhabited. So place your myth opposite God's truth, and you get that repetitive phrase, I am Yahweh, he who caused to be, he who is, and he who will be, and there is no other. Now, also, he said, I didn't speak in secret. He actually came to his people, coming to Noah, coming to Abraham, coming to Jacob, and speaking to them. He didn't speak in secret. It's not like the dark temples of Mesopotamia that even had, some hidden dark places. And the priests had dark secrets, frightening secrets. Many things were held in the dark to keep things mysterious. But God says, that's not the way I operate. I speak to my people, and I don't speak in a land of darkness. Why do you suppose that is? First John tells us God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. So once again, it is exactly the opposite of what the exiles were facing and seeing in Mesopotamia. So I am Yahweh who speaks salvation instead of mystery, salvation instead of extortion, salvation instead of imprisonment, asceticism, whatever else false religions may bring on you. And I declare what is true. So assemble yourselves and come. Draw near together, you survivors of the nations. The nations have no knowledge, so they carry about their wooden idols and pray to a God who cannot save. So, nations, survivors, declare and present your case. Sounds a whole lot like we've read in 43 and 44, doesn't it? Yes, take counsel together. Who told this long ago? Who declared it of old? Was it not I, Yahweh? And there is no other God besides me. The repetition continues, except it's expanded. It's not just saying there is no other, it's saying there is no other God besides me. There is no righteous and helping God besides me. I'm the only one. So turn to me, and he helped. That's the testimony a true believer would get. All the ends of the earth. For I am God, and there is no other. Wow, there's that repetition, yet again, underscoring the truth of God. By myself I swear. From my mouth goes forth a word that does not return. To me, every knee bows, every tongue swears. Truly, in Yahweh there is salvation and strength. To him come in shame all who were incensed against him. In Yahweh, all the offspring of Israel have salvation and glory. So this deliverance comes only from knowing, trusting, and obeying Yahweh. He is God, and there is no other. And even though in the animated figure on the right side of the screen, we have Cyrus in charge, it's only because Yahweh and no other has put him in charge. Okay, I'm going to close it off there and do 46 as a separate video and upload it next week.